yeah, multi-scale analysis of climate policy is what this is about. And our concept of multi-scale is that there are developments at the global level, like climate change, like climate policy, that have important impacts at the local level. And those local impacts vary a lot. And in the GTAP community, hitherto, we really haven't been able to characterize that heterogeneity. And now we're getting to the point where we can begin to do that, and we're using gridded modeling in conjunction with GTAP style modeling at that more aggregate level. So that's what this session is about, how to do that, what interesting insights come out of that for focusing on US climate policy. And it's not just the global to the local, but it's also how the local then feeds back through markets. So global, local, global is the theme. And we've got 4 talks. We'll start with Uris Baldos, who will be talking about impacts of US climate policy broadly and also in the rest of the world. And then Jing will talk about the implications for water quality, nitrate leaching in particular, some interesting co-benefits surface there. I'll sub for Iman Haqiqi, who is in Iran right now and unable to be on with us. And then we'll conclude with David Johnson talking about bringing in the biofuels dimension of that. So yeah, without further ado, I'll pass it over to Uris. Do you want to screen share, please?
I muted, all right. So yeah, I'll start. I have my timer here, so just to make sure that we're on time. So yeah, I'm Uris Baldos, and I'm here to present on behalf of my co-authors, Maksym, Chepeliev, Jing, Iman Haqiqi, Tom Hertel, and Dominique van der Mensburghe. And this paper is really about trying to see how climate policy, specifically policies pricing carbon in the US, how would that affect US agriculture, the land use change, water use, and also nitrogen leaching. And what we're doing here is we're using 2 models. One is a global CGE model, and one is a partial equilibrium model that has a high resolution in terms of where crops are being produced in the US. All right. So to motivate this presentation, we know that the US administration currently has ambitious climate plans, including a 2050 carbon neutrality goal. And we also know that agriculture is one of the largest emitter of non-CO2 GHG emissions. But when we're thinking of policies that we could enact in order to abate these emissions, it's going to be difficult. There may be some costs involved, or the technology is not yet there, or it may be politically infeasible. But let's imagine a scenario wherein we could implement such a policy similar to the EU trading system, and just focusing on carbon emissions in agriculture. And the idea there is that, what's going to be the impact if we have this hypothetical policy of carbon prices. And here's a stylized figure of what could be a very messy, I guess, workflow in terms of how things are going to be affected. So if you're thinking of having a carbon pricing in the US, that would bump up energy and fuel costs, and that would be translating to changes in fertilizer prices. But there may also be some interaction between fertilizer prices, the amount of fertilizer that farmer used, and it could trickle down to the amount of nitrogen leaching occurring in the continental US. And then when you're thinking of changes in fuel prices, you're also going to see increases in cost of production. That would mean that there will be changes in how things are being grown in the continental US, depending on the cost shares of energy and also fertilizer. And it also would have some implication in terms of food prices. So in order to really tease out this, these interaction effects, and that's why we're doing this particular paper. So the key questions that we're trying to address in this paper would be, what are the implications of carbon pricing in US agriculture? What would be the spatial distribution of such impacts? And also, what would be the impacts on the rest of the world? So to answer these questions, we're using two types of models. First would be your envisaged model, environmental impact, sustainability, applied general equilibrium model. And we're using a static version of this global CGE models. So think about 14 regions, 41 activities, and US would be a separate sector. And for this particular version, we're tracking fossil fuel combustion within the economy. So if you look at the simplified figure, this is how we try to link these two models together. So first, you'll have some carbon pricing scenarios that's going to be externally crafted. And you implement those carbon pricing scenarios in the envisaged model. And that would produce some outputs. And those outputs would be transferred to the simple model, which I'll talk about later. And the simple model will then generate the changes in US agriculture at the continental US at a fine scale. So changes in crop production, cropland cover, nitrogen use, nitrate leaching, and water use. Now, when we are moving outputs from envisaged to simple, there needs to be some sort of harmonization. And these are the things that we've done so far. So we assume that in the envisaged model, land supply would be perfectly elastic, and that producer prices will be fixed in the US. And the idea there is that the envisaged would capture all of the demand side effects. And the job of Simple G is to capture the supply side changes in production and factors of production, and also the input use. So what is this Simple G model? Well, SIMPLE stands for a Simplified International Model of Agriculture, Prices, Land Use, and the Environment. And we're using a gridded version. So think about the continental US divided into 40,000 grid cells. And each of these grid cells would have a defined crop supply for irrigated and rain-fed systems, defined nitrogen use and nitrogen leaching curves, water use, as also land use in terms of cropland use. Now, for this version, we're using the corn-soy version. So we're just looking into production in the US for corn and soy crops. And we're actually combining these two together to just have like one composite crop that's going to be produced in the model. Now, Simple G also has national markets for crops, livestock, and processed food. And it also has global trade for crops. So crops that could not going to be produced in the US could be produced in the rest of the world. And then it also has a robust information on the production parameters, nitrogen leaching, surface water and ground use, water use, and also cropland use. So when we are designing the scenarios, this is the general workflow, and this is done in Envisage. So we start with the reference case, and we implement this EU climate mitigation policy on that reference case or reference year. So think about a 89 euros per ton of CO2 emissions that's going to be implemented in the EU, plus carbon border adjustments. And that when you implement that policy, you're going to have a new reference year or an updated base year. And then once you have that updated base year wherein this EU mitigation policy is already incorporated, we then apply the US climate policy. And we're focusing on three carbon pricing scenarios, the 51, 76, and $152 per metric tons of CO2 emissions. And once we implement those policies, we then get the outputs from Envisage and pass them to the simple model, Simple G model. Now, the key items that we're passing from Envisage to Simple would be changes in energy prices. We're also passing other things too, like changes in crop output and changes in the factor payments of production, like labor, capital, and so on. But the changes in those are very, very little with the policies. It's really the energy prices that's driving most of the story here. So here you're looking at a figure that shows you changes in electricity prices, petroleum products, and natural gas across different social costs of carbon. And there's this huge increase in natural gas when you have a higher social cost of carbon. Now, in order to pass these information to Simple G, we need to convert it into or variables that Simple G uses. So one variable would be the nitrogen fertilizer cost. And in order to generate those costs, we assume a cost share for nitrogen or ammonia production. So we get information from changes in energy prices, get information in cost shares, in the production of ammonia, which we kind of equate to nitrogen, and then that would give us the changes in nitrogen fertilizer prices. Specifically for 51, you have like a 30% increase, 51 social cost of carbon, 45% increase, and up to 91% increase if you have like $152 per metric tons of CO2 emissions. So that's one input that we're passing. Another input would be non-land input prices. And again, similar to what we did with the ammonia, we got information from USDA on county level cost shares. So we funnel the changes in energy prices, changes in factors of production through these cost shares in order to generate the change in non-land input price, which we then use in Simple G. And the same thing is what we're doing with the cost of water withdrawals. And this is going to be implemented only in the irrigation systems, or rather the irrigated crop production system in Simple G. So that's the way we design in terms of how we link these three together, these two models together for each of these climate scenarios. So now we're looking at the outputs in Simple G. First, we're looking at output. So as you can see here, if we look at the percentage change in corn soy production, as you increase the social cost of carbon from $51 up to $152, you see that there will be a decline in corn soy production, which is it makes sense because a higher cost of or higher carbon prices would push up the cost of producing corn soy output in the US, and that would mean farmers would have to reduce their production. What's interesting here is that there's this leakage effect in terms of production in the rest of the world going up. So it goes up by around 15 million metric tons if you focus on the highest cost of carbon pricing. And it's not enough to offset the reduction that we're observing here in the US, which is around 25 million metric tons of corn soy production. So because overall you're going to have like a global reduction in crop output, so that could have some implication in terms of higher prices in at the global market, and that could have an effect in terms of like food security and so on, which we haven't really explored in full detail. Again, here's the distribution of how the U.S. rain-fed crop output would change across different carbon pricing scenarios. As you could quickly see here, higher carbon prices will mean larger reduction in rain-fed crop output. And most of the losses would be located in regions where corn and soybeans are being produced, mostly in the corn Belt region. That's the region wherein you have a lot of corn and soybeans that's being produced under rain-fed production systems. For irrigated crop output change, here we see again that higher cost of carbon would mean greater reduction in output. And most of the reduction in output for the irrigated systems would be occurring in the Nebraska area, Kansas area, and also states wherein they're near the Mississippi River. So you have Missouri, Arkansas, and then Mississippi itself. All right, so now let's explore what would happen to the input use when we have this reduction in crop production because of this higher cost of production and because of the climate policies that we're implementing. So what we're seeing here is that as you increase the carbon price again, we'll see that you'll have more and more reduction in terms of cropland area within the US because you're we're producing less crops in the US than it's going abroad. So it could be up to around 1.6% reduction if you have the highest social cost of carbon that's being implemented. But what's interesting to see here is if we look at like the absolute changes, we see that across all of these scenarios, the increase in the rest of the world is actually much larger than the reduction in the US. So if you're thinking of like a net effect of this policy in terms of global land use change, it could actually encourage land use change to be more, to increase at least at the global level. And that could have some implication in terms of, if you're thinking of leakage effects due to land use change emissions, for example, or natural area for biodiversity. That's something that we'll probably have to dig deeper on to see what's the implication of a global increase in land from this policy. So here we're looking at the distribution of cropland use change within the US for the rain-fed systems. Again, most of the change in the rain-fed crop areas are located in the rain-fed sector, in the Corn Belt. So this is rain-fed cropland area. But if you look at some parts of the rain-fed systems, the ones which are highlighted in the circles, there are some grids wherein you're seeing an expansion in rain-fed area. And if we look quickly at the irrigated areas, you can see that those expansion in the rain-fed area is actually occurring wherein you have a large reduction in irrigated cropland area. So at least from these results, it seems that there's this movement away from irrigated cropland systems to rain-fed cropland systems, at least for some of the grid cells. This is something that we'll probably have to investigate the reason why. Maybe it's because of differences in cost shares or because of the way we're implementing the penalty for irrigated production because of this increased water withdrawals, the cost of water withdrawals. And now let's take a look at the end leaching. So here we're seeing again this pattern wherein you have high carbon prices, you have lower crop production in the US, and then you're also facing a higher fertilizer price in the US. And that would have a huge impact in terms of discouraging farmers to use nitrogen fertilizer. And as you can see here, in terms of percentage changes, at the highest level of the social cost of carbon, you could actually reduce the nitrogen leaching by around 18% within the continental US. So this shows you that there are some like co-benefits when we're trying to look at the other effects of this climate policy. So the climate policy doesn't just address the climate itself, like GHG emissions and so on, but it could also have impact in terms of like water quality, improving water quality by curtailing nitrogen leaching. And here's the distribution of the nitrogen leaching change within the continental US. So most of the reduction in nitrogen leaching, again, are occurring in areas wherein you have high concentration of rain-fed production in the Corn Belt region. And then there's some interesting reduction of nitrogen leaching along the Mississippi River area. For irrigated leaching, most of the reduction in nitrogen leaching would be occurring in the Nebraska area and also in the states which are near the Mississippi. So that's going to be Missouri, Arkansas, and also Mississippi. Now, we're also reporting changes in water withdrawals in the US. And similar to what we're seeing here in the nitrogen leaching, because the cost of producing crops in the US would be much higher with these carbon pricing policies, there's a tendency to actually reduce the change in water use, at least for the corn soy production. So up to around like 7%. So there could be some co-benefits in terms of eliminating groundwater withdrawals in sensitive areas in the US when you have water scarcity. But there's a big caveat in terms of the results in the water information that we're generating here, because we're only focusing on like the corn soy crop. So it's just one sliver of crop production in the US. The results might be different, as Tom will show you earlier. The results could be different when you use a model that looks into all crops being produced in the US.
2 minutes, Uris.
Okay, thanks, Maksym. And just to conclude this presentation, so we saw that carbon pricing raises the cost of production in the US, and that would mean that there will be an expansion of crops production in the rest of the world. But one surprising thing in what we saw is that rest of the world cropland area would expand, and that could have some other effects in terms of land use change emissions and also natural land cover for biodiversity that we will probably have to explore further. And then we saw that these carbon pricing policies would have co-benefits, and maybe we could use these co-benefits as a way to boost this, the benefits that we could get from these climate policies. And then one conclusion that we saw is that the heterogeneity in the US will be dependent on the cost shares that we're getting from USDA, especially when cost share of nitrogen fertilizers generally higher in rain-fed production and irrigated production. And in terms of future work, we'll explore the interaction with climate policies and environmental policies to see if there are like trade-offs and co-benefits. And yep, I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks, Uris. Floor is open for discussion. I'll kill my video again just because I'm a bit unreliable on the internet today. But please, if you stop sharing, we should be able to see everyone. Sure. And if people could come off mute and show their video when they talk, that'd be great. Mark Horridge. Mark, yeah.
Yeah, so I had a couple of questions. So I don't know if your model says anything about this, but should we suppose that corn, soy production in the rest of the world uses much less fertilizer? Or have we just shifted fertilizer use to another place? And second, what happens to the land which is no longer used for corn and soy?
Yeah, those are great questions. So first, in terms of the land, right now, the idea is you're gonna reduce cropland use in that particular grid cell. So maybe the idea there would be to reallocate that into to either natural land cover or maybe to livestock. But since we're just using a partial equilibrium model of cropland, we really can't tell much in terms of where that reduction in cropland will be placed. So we could probably just assume that it's going to be going to the natural use. And in terms of nitrogen use in the rest of the world, so currently the model is calibrated only for the US. We may need to put additional effort in terms of getting additional information on nitrogen use in the rest of the world, and also for leaching. Because you're right, it might be that we're implementing a policy here in the US, and that could have some leakage effects that could occur abroad. And we also saw that when we're looking at like the cropland area. You see the production in the rest of the world increases, cropland area in the rest of the world increases. And that could have implications in terms of like nitrogen use and water use in the rest of the world.
Mark, do you want to follow up on that at all, or?
Oh, you're muted. You're muted.
While you're coming off mute, Mark, let me just say that these two externalities are quite different. The nitrate leaching is a local externality. I mean, polluting groundwater in the very places where they're growing the crops, and also then streams and flowing eventually out into the Gulf. But it's not an international externality the way greenhouse gas emissions are. So they're these different scales, but you're right, you can certainly push some of your negative externality onto other people, and we're seeing that.
No follow-up.
Okay. Jing, do you want to comment?
Yeah, so I just want to say something about fertilizer use in Brazil, because Brazil is another major producer of corn and soy, and then it heavily used fertilizer because of the soil quality. It's type of red soy that's typically nutrient inefficient if just rely on the natural nutrient supplied in the soil. And on the other hand, the fertilizer used in the country is heavily dependent on import. So like about 80% of the nitrogen fertilizer is imported from the global market. And yeah, so with the high fertilizer price observed around the world, I think Brazil is feeling the hurt, because it's almost a necessary input for them to grow, to maintain the yields. And China, of course, is more or less excessively using nitrogen fertilizer as well. Yeah, maybe Jason can say something about European countries.
Jason, you've been called out and you have your hand up, so doubly go for it.
No, I can't say anything about nitrogen use in European countries. Sorry, at this point. I have a question to focus on slightly different areas. So you mentioned leakages a couple times, but maybe I missed it. But I didn't see anything about CO2 emissions, because the goal of the policy is to reduce CO2 emissions, and we're looking at agriculture. So it's sort of the basic question is, does this reduce CO2 emissions from agriculture for this crop globally, right? So you see that production increases somewhere else, but does that mean CO2 emissions? And two other questions, maybe we can answer those together. But so are these so we saw reduction in nitrogen and also nitrogen leakages and irrigation water withdrawals, and you showed on the map sort of where there's reduction of these crop production. And I'm basically wondering for both of these things, is it just reduced? Is this simply reduced production means less nitrogen and irrigation, or are we seeing some sort of efficiency changes that were sort of just using less irrigation for the same crop, or less fertilizer for the same crop? And similarly, for where we're seeing the reductions on the map, is there some specific determinant that's saying why crops would be reduced somewhere else, or is it really just this is where the most crops are grown, and so we're seeing a reduction, so we're seeing most reduction there? So wondering if there's some determinants underneath that's showing these things. Thanks.
Yeah, those are really great questions. So for the first question, yeah, this is something that we've struggled a lot, because ideally you want to implement a carbon policy that's going to occur in like all countries, like implement the US and EU policy together and then plug that into Simple G. But yeah, we're struggling in terms of trying to make the models being harmonized in terms of the economic responses, and that's why we're going on this approach. But yeah, you're right. We've looked into this leakage effects here, at least from this partial analysis, and yeah, there could be some feedback effects in terms of higher GHG emissions. I mean, right off the bat, we could calculate like land use change emissions from what we're generating here, and we could calculate that to see whether we're reducing, at least with the land use change emissions, we're reducing it with we're able to reduce it with this type of policy. And then for the second question, I think There are some interaction effects. Let me just quickly show because there was a slide wherein there was a little circles, which kind of shows you some movement away from irrigated production system towards rain-fed production system, at least for land. So this could be some evidence of the improvements in terms of efficiency by switching from different production systems that are less affected by these carbon pricing policies. But yeah, we have to take a look a deeper look on why these grid cells are changing. Are they changing because we're implementing the shocks in terms of higher cost of water withdrawals, or there may be other drivers that's going around? Yeah, and it's going to be hard, especially if you're thinking of 40,000 grid cells, trying to look into the question. But yeah, you're right. We need to try to explain why these things are occurring.
Maksym, I think you're going to be wrapping it up probably. Maybe you could speak to the greenhouse gas emission thing more generally.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, we just to chime in and also wrap up. So on the interaction effects and intensive margins, just to note that Jing would partly discuss this question in her talk in terms of nitrogen leaching. So that would be another kind of opportunity to explore this question. And then on the emission side, we indeed do observe some leakage for the case of agriculture greenhouse gases, but it's relatively small compared to reductions in energy use CO2 emissions in US. So we implement, just to remind, we implement a carbon pricing in US plus CBAM by US. So that's what we do. And then these reductions in emissions in US and CO2 are pretty substantial. Again, there is some leakage in terms of energy-related CO2 in the rest of the world, but that's relatively minor compared to non-CO2 greenhouse gas emission changes. So yeah. Okay, I think we now need to move to the next presenter, and I'll give floor to Tom to introduce, or just directly to the presenter.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. So Jing Liu, Jing will follow on, I think, a close handoff from Uris to Jing, or Jing to Uris, back and forth. They've been collaborating on this, and Jing's been diving into the water quality issue. So over to you, Jing.
Thank you, Tom. And Uris did a great job for setting up the framework and all the details about Simple G and why we're doing this. My talk will be focusing on a particular application by looking at the nitrate leaching associated with nitrate fertilizer use. And so the question we're trying to answer here is if the carbon policy can help improve the water quality in the United States. Of course, we saw some previous study on this topic, and they generally reported some co-benefits and side effects of carbon policies. So yours talk about the high energy cost that could drive up the price of fertilizer use, and in the US, particularly for the corn production, the cost share of nitrogen fertilizer range about 20% up and down, depending on which agriculture zone we're talking about. So this could have an impact on production cost and then farmers' income. But most of those literature reported also some benefits emerged from implementing the carbon policies by showing some positive environmental quality improvements, such as reducing nitrogen leaching because the fertilizer use is reduced, and also some reduction in soil erosion because some of those farmers, they are implementing the conservation practices, try to keep the carbon sequestration in the fields. And so we definitely see some mixed outcomes out of those carbon policies. And this raised another type of question about talking about the effective, like efficient design of climate change policy and the conservation policy. So, so there are a few papers talk about the comparison of between implementing the policies individually and combined. So they find some kind of policies, if you apply them alone, they will have some unintended consequences appear outside of the scope of the policy. But if you try to combine them together, sometimes they can overcome those negative externalities out of the policy. But all these papers kind of share some limitations. Some early studies, they typically assume fixed commodity prices. Then many of them reported negative impact on farm income because they take into account the increasing input cost, but not the increasing commodity prices. And then the later studies kind of relax that assumption, but some of them are doing the country level modeling and do not show the spatial pattern of the details, the hotspot within the country. And then for the studies, they do have those spatial details. Sometimes they focus on a particular region and couldn't really capture the interaction between that small region with the rest of the country and even with the global market. So we try to use this paper to kind of update the literature by improving those weakness. And it's also an extension of a previous study we did to look at the effectiveness of nitrate leaching management practices in the Corn Belt in the US. So we look at different conservation practices, including collecting leaching tax, like doing some nitrogen management practices like set dressing, precise application, and also some location-specific conservation practices like control drainage and wetland restoration, and compare them individually and combine to see how effective they can reduce the nitrate load in the Mississippi River Basin that has been causing the hypoxia problem in the Gulf of Mexico. So what we found previously was there was no single policy that is able to achieve the hypoxia task force goal that to reduce the nitrate leaching in the Gulf of Mexico by 45% in order to reduce the area of the dead zone to a more acceptable size. So individually, those practices can reduce the overall nitrogen leaching load by 9% to 15%. So wetland seems to be the most single effective practices. But those who are still within the domain of conservation practices, and in this paper, we start to explore what if we combine the carbon policy and with those conservation practices to see if they can further improve water quality and how effectively they are compared to the conservation policies alone. So The model we're using is a special version of Simple G. Yours talk about the general framework of Simple G, and the version we're using is the Simple G US corn soy. So corn soy, because corn is nitrogen intensive crop, and then it also always often rotate with soybeans. So we focus on only 2 crops, but they're aggregated into a crop composite. And then the whole US is downscaled into more than 48,000 grid cells with a resolution of 5 arc minutes. So 5 arc minutes, we're talking about a pixel about 10 kilometer by 10 kilometer at equator, and in the corn belt, maybe it's a smaller of 8 by 8 kilometer. And then the rest of the world, the non-US regions are aggregated into 16 regions. So we still keep them in the background to so they can interact with US market. And then a special feature of this model is we included some biophysical relationship into the model. And those are the emulators. We call them emulators because they capture some relationship between the crop yields to nitrogen fertilizer application, as well as the leaching response to nitrogen use. And those curves are estimated using the output of process-based agroecosystem model called AgriAbis. So basically on the right-hand side, if you see the AgriAbis simulated all those pairs between nitrogen use and yields or leaching, and then we just feed the transfer function with location-specific parameters and embedded those coefficients into the simple model. And all these parameters are vary by grid cell and by irrigated rain-fed activities. So to give you a flavor of those curves, so I pick 4 points in the US to show how different they are between different irrigation activities. So there are 48,000 different curves for rain-fed and the same amount for the irrigated. So you see a lot of variation there. And then the leaching emulator is in the form of a quadratic. So as you keep increasing the fertilizer intensity, fertilizer application intensity, the leaching will go up dramatically. But for the yields, the benefit of keep applying additional units of nutrient, your yield benefit becomes smaller and smaller. So you see this plateau at the very high level of fertilizer application rate. Another way of using those curves is to translate them into the elasticities of substitution in the CET functions. And then the formula of doing this is to, if you know the Gompertz function, that's your production as a univariate function of the fertilizer application, and you know the first derivative and the second derivative of that function, that gives you the elasticity at a certain level of nitrogen fertilizer application rate. So use this formula and all the data we plug in to calculate the elasticity of substitution between nitrogen fertilizer and land for irrigated corn, rain-fed corn production. And then you see a lot of variation across the US, and it also shows a generally larger elasticity for the irrigated practice than the rain-fed practice. So these are how we embedded the biophysical information into the model. And for the experimental design, so we consider two sets of experiments. One is carbon pricing only. So pretty much what Uris presented, but well, I will show more on the impacts on leaching. And we did this at the 3 different levels of carbon pricing at 47, 70, and $139 per ton carbon equivalent. These numbers are slightly different from what you saw in Uris because we are showing this using different reference years. So I'm using the 2014 US dollar as my reference, and Uris used 2020 US dollars as this reference. So we're basically doing the same shocks. But in addition, I also look at the combined policy of those carbon pricing with the wetland restoration simultaneously. So how this works in the model is if you look at the carbon pricing alone, because the higher fertilizer use, that forced the farmers to reduce their application rate from a higher level to a lower level. So we are moving along this curve from a high nutrient application to a lower. So that expected to reduce the leaching more significantly than the yields if the farmer is already applying the nutrient at this flat part of the yield response. And if you look at the wetland, so we're not only moving along the curve, but also shifting the curve down to a lower level. That means because wetland is more or less like a post application treatment that doesn't really need farmers to reduce a lot of fertilizer application. But once the nutrient is dumped in the water, the wetland will denitrify and take care of the removal. So it's like for the same amount of fertilizer applied, your leaching will be lower because of the biophysical treatment. And so in that case, you will see an even higher level of leaching reduction. So this is how the policies will work, so the mechanism behind the model, so it can be translated back to the outcome of leaching. To look at some results, the first one we want to look is at the national level. So we find, so the combined policies have a much larger impact on nitrogen application and crop output than the wetland alone. So if you look at the left-hand side, the dots, those are the wetland only from our previous study that doesn't include the carbon pricing. So you see there are about 15% of leaching reduction due to wetland restoration, but barely has any impact on fertilizer use and crop output because it doesn't affect farmers' behavior of using fertilizer. But later on, when you introduce the carbon pricing and combined with the wetland, you see start to see some impact on output and fertilizer use because of the more expensive fertilizer application. And then the impact just get bigger when you move to a higher level of carbon pricing. But for the highest level of pricing at 139, the combined policy can have a 30% reduction in leaching. And then individually, so if you look at the carbon alone, So it gives about 18% at Uris talk about. So that means even you don't consider any conservation practices, just by carbon pricing alone is already pretty effective, can be only more efficient than wetland restoration. And then of course, we see a larger impact on food price than the wetland alone. And then, so where does this lateral leaching reduction come from? So we try to decompose the total amount of reduction into the extensive and intensive margin. So for the carbon policy alone, you see a very large share comes from the intensive margin. That means you're moving along this curve. Those are your contribution of the leaching reduction, but the area contraction contributes a very small share. But compared between lower level and higher level of carbon, you see the higher level carbon kind of force more land out of production because the low profitability. So you see the land, the row of land is a bit higher at a higher level of pricing. But the combined policy generally contributes more from the leaching side because the very powerful leaching removal from the wetland. And then we know this is a move along the leaching curve, but by how much? So this plot of density shows for the combined policy, it's around 15 to 20% of the leaching rate. So the rule of thumb is about 1/3 of the application is lost in the water eventually. So if you're applying 150 kilogram per hectare, about 50 kilogram per hectare will be leached into the water. And by considering the combined policy, you're reducing those leaching rates 1/3 by about 20%. So that gives you a big reduction for the combined policy. And for the carbon alone, we see that reduction is lower. But the peak value is around 10 or 20, but we do see some very effective gray cells shown by these fat tails on the left-hand side.
You have 2 minutes, even less. So.
Yeah, and the final results we're showing is this spillover effect. So previously, the wetlands have some externalities because the cost of wetland restoration lowers the competitive advantage of those gray cells. They adopting the practices. So the production is kind of displaced to the other area. They don't have to adopt a wetland. And then, but when we look at the combined policy, this spillover effect disappears because everybody has to carry the cost of carbon pricing. That kind of overcome this externality of wetland. And so you see the reduction of production and leaching almost everywhere. To sum up our findings, so by combining the carbon pricing, the wetland, and some nitrogen management practices, it's still possible to achieve the 45% reduction by the hypoxia task force goals. And then we find more of the reduction come from the intensive margin rather than the extensive margin of the mitigation. And we do see the combined policy have some advantage to overcome the negative externalities caused by the policy implementation alone. So the next step, we'll look at some yield impacts of combined policy. So here we look at details of leaching but not along the yield curves yet. So this could tell us what is the carbon pricing that could help us achieve the optimal nitrogen application rate if we're talking about the economic goal or environmental goal instead of carbon emissions. And then we'll look at some benefits of coordinating those carbon policies and conservation policies, because and Tom will talk some about the carbon tax revenue allocation that's lead by DJ, and also the ownership of externality, because for the carbon, farmers can take credit, but not from the leakage they saved from those programs. And also some farmers can take double credit from both, because and they reduce the carbon, but they are still get paid from the conservation program. So that may have some efficiency design issues for different programs. And then finally, we want to address the uncertainties in the framework by looking at how the sensitivity of parameters to behavior change, and also some biophysical process like the transportation of the nutrient along the river. Yeah, I'll stop here and open up for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jing. Any questions? Jing, if you stop sharing, we'll be able to see everyone on our screens.
Yep.
While we're waiting, Maksym, do you want to say anything about social cost of carbon? Gita raised some questions about where these prices were coming from.
Yeah. So we are taking for our carbon pricing scenarios, we are taking 3 different levels of carbon price, and those are based on their social cost of carbon estimates from officials from the US government. And actually, I think, yes, there have been some issues with legislation regarding passing this in different states, but I think they have been resolved actually last week. So these are almost official estimates. And we are looking into 3%, 2% average discount rates, and also 95 percentile, which gives us this high $152 carbon price. Yeah.
Okay. Any other? Oh, Ron, please, Ron.
Okay, thanks for the presentation. I just have a question about the yield curves, the yield response curves. And I missed the first few minutes, so I guess I'm not quite sure where they come from. Are these coming from crop model simulations originally, and or parameterizations of different crop models? I know in work I've done in the past, crop models, different crop models can introduce a lot of variability into simulation results. So just wondering what kind of crop models or that may have informed those yield response curves.
Yeah, so probably it's helpful to bring up the slides showing the curves. We use the output from AgroAbis. It's a agro ecosystem model. So basically, they simulate the yields at different levels of fertilizer application, and like output those combinations. And then they do have multiple modules in AgroAbis to take care of soil quality, carbon, the temperature, precipitation, as well as the I think zone. So the root zone of the crop, and so they're process based. And then we just collect those pairs and feed a curve for each individual grid cell. And then it's a Gompertz function, so we have the parameters for each grid cell and embedded those into our model.
Great, thanks. That helps.
Yeah.
Jing, do you want to stop sharing again and so we can see everyone?
Yep.
Any other questions here for Jing? Looks like you blew them all away, Jing. It's there's just nothing left to be said or asked about.
Good.
I have a quick clarification question if there's still time.
Yeah.
You mentioned towards the end that you're comparing the carbon cost with the cost of wetlands, and I was maybe I was a bit confused, but this increased wetlands, is that how is that brought in as a cost into the model, or is there any are you just looking at the benefits of these increased wetlands, or is that reducing the agricultural land, or someone paying for this, or maybe I was a bit confused about that point.
So wetland in general has two types of cost. One is the construction cost. So you have those material and labor and take away a small part of land from agriculture production. And also it has a maintenance cost. And then in the model, we change the productivity of non-land, like those AF terms, non-land, to kind of capture this additional cost. So you have to spend more on those non-land factors to be able to produce the same amount. Also, we reduce the area of agricultural crop area. So it's a small amount, if you have a 1% or 0.5% of your land converted to wetland, it can take care of your entire field by processing the leaching. That's because it's a cost sharing program, so farmers does carry some of those costs along the production.
Okay, but if it's really a small area, it sounds that the real cost is the construction maintenance cost and not the land losses, or? Yeah,
the land cost is small. Where the standard is like a treatment ratio is about 1:22. So like 1 hectare, 1 acre of wetland can treat 22 acre of cropland. So it's a very effective way. Thank you for the question, Jason.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, well, if not, we may move a little bit ahead of schedule. Is that okay, Maksym?
Yeah, sure.
Especially in light of the fact that my internet may bomb in the middle of this. I'm really sorry, I don't have my video on. I really like to see people, and like you to see me, but it seems like I'm stressing things out in this location where I am right now. So I'll go ahead and share screen. I'm substituting for Iman Haqiqi, who Iman is currently in Iran, and his internet connection is even worse than mine in Berlin. So I will, without further ado, I'll proceed and present that. And share screen, and Maksym, let me know when and if I bomb. Sure. So I'm going to share a screen, and go full screen. Is that showing up okay?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, good. Okay, again, on behalf of Iman, here we are. So you've seen a deep dive into the nitrate leaching, the corn soy production, a little bit on irrigation, although the amount of irrigated corn is not that much. We saw that most of the action there was, say, in Nebraska. So now we're going to look at all of the crops, and with a focus more on irrigation and how that irrigation might be affected by climate policy. So a bit of an overview here. I won't linger on this. We're going to repeat a few of the points made earlier on about simple G, just to get everyone comfortable with it. So we're interested in the spatial impacts. We're going to be driving these largely through the input cost changes that you've seen documented already. Those will now be fed into a model that has a different cost structure and a different spatial extent, because we're talking about all the crops now. So it becomes a little easier to answer the question that Mark Horridge raised, namely, where does the cropland go if it leaves production in simple G here? It's going into non-crop uses. Will this help with the water problem in the Western US, or will it exacerbate it? That's an interesting question. Co-benefit or co-cost. So the pathways will be, we've got this agricultural production function. You've heard about it already. Now we're talking land, water, labor, capital, fertilizers, seeds, chemicals, energy. These are all inputs that prices could be affected. This will be informed from the envisage model, as well as some side calculations where we don't have enough detail in the envisage model. So change in prices generates a change in these cost minimizing mixes. To go back to a question that was asked earlier about efficiency, we're assuming that presented with these prices, producers are efficient in a technical and economic sense. So it's really a choice of technique. They have a certain technology. Are they going to modify their input use in light of the price changes? So there's no change in technology here in this simulation. We're going to focus most on energy and fertilizer. That's where the action is. But we will be talking a little more about energy, given its importance in irrigation. So just a nitrogen fertilizer. This work was done a bit earlier on. So we're talking about $100 carbon price. You've seen things ranging more widely in the other presentations. This was done earlier on. So that's what we'll be assuming here. So there's not a harmonization across these studies as you're seeing them presented presently, although we're aiming to do that. So fertilizer price goes up. But now a little more on the water side. So irrigation has a substantial labor component as well as an energy component. So those play a role. And now it's interesting that in some parts of the country, natural gas is being used. So if you're sitting over a gas well in Texas, you're very likely to use gas to irrigate, to fuel your irrigation pumps. There's other places it's petroleum, other places it's electricity. So those price changes, you can see here, these are the price changes associated with the $100 carbon pricing. You can see very substantial for natural gas. So that's another source of heterogeneity, not just are you using energy, but which type of energy are you using? There are other inputs that play a role, and we're getting those wage changes and other fuels costs from envisage. Okay, so these are heterogeneous. We've heard a lot about that. I want to dwell a little more on that. Iman has fortunately put together a few slides covering these cost shares, so you'll get to see a visual on that. There was a question about what's driving the heterogeneity. Well, it's the data, the information that USDA has provided on these cost shares. And the technology is different for irrigated and non-irrigated at the same location. So here's some cost shares you can see. So big ones on the left and the right, fuels and fertilizer. And you can see that fertilizer tends to be a larger share of costs in the East. Well, why? Because you don't have all those irrigation costs. In the West, you've got more irrigation costs and hence more fuel costs typically. So there's a broad East-West distinction there. And then in the middle, you see other important expenses, although the wage changes aren't significant in this case. Contract labor, obviously big in the fruitful rim, California, Florida, lot of fruits and vegetables, seeds, and other kinds of expenses big in the Corn Belt, where we're using a lot of these expensive seeds. And on the top, I can't quite see that on my screen, but I think it's the other expenses. The energy mix, an important point. So Iman has dug into a bit deeper into the energy and the energy mix used for irrigation. So you can see that, as I was foreshadowing earlier on, if you're in Texas, Oklahoma, where you're sitting on top of a bunch of natural gas, you might be using more of that natural gas. And you can see, unfortunately, this slide is a bit, I'm blocking you a little bit here with some things, but you can see electricity in blue. That's big in Nevada, for example. Natural gas, big in Kansas and Texas. And diesel is used in Mississippi, for example, probably close to some of those refineries. These other things aren't as cheap. So the kind of energy you use varies. We're not going to be focusing on changing your sourcing of energy, just focused on, if they don't, given the current mix of energy, how is irrigated agriculture affected? So we're trying to make maximum use of this gridded information that USDA and others provide. It's a rich source of data, and we hate to average it all out and put it in a national, just in a national model. So just a little bit on the global thing. In the context of water shortages and water scarcity, we're interested in whether this global or national policy exacerbates that or not, and what kind of spillover effects might arise. You saw spillover effects in the case of the corn soy model. We expect to see some here as well. Some areas hit hard, prices go up, other areas step in. That's the kind of spillover we can look at. Iman talks a little here about other different modeling approaches, which is a good point. I mean, there are a lot of different models that are used to look at this kind of thing. There's the GloBio model, which is an optimization model. So a little bit of a different approach, a big linear programming model to tackling this kind of thing. They've, to my knowledge, haven't been able to work at this level of resolution because of the overall ambitions of the model, and haven't perhaps gotten as much into some of the water issues. GCAM, Iman is referring to some of the downscaling that occurs there. Obviously, you can do that in GTAP as well. GTAP AZ, you could downscale further from there. Agent-based models, we hear a lot about those when we work with Department of Energy. Of course, they don't assume, there's no role for equilibrium in that case. So simple G is the equilibrium model, and it is partial equilibrium with all those limitations. It's more of a framework. You saw one version of simple G a moment ago. This is a different version of simple G. There's a global gridded version of simple G and versions for China and Brazil and so on. So it's like GTAP, it's a framework that you aggregate to different levels depending on the problem at hand. So this is the all crops model. So now rather than 47,000 grids, or 75,000 grids. Why? Because we're looking at, we're encompassing a lot of the West where there isn't corn, soy, but other crops are being grown, especially irrigated crops. Again, as Uris and Jing said in the background, we've got these 16 global regions. So there is, at least, while we're not intervening in the rest of the world, we are tracking their response to a US-based policy. A little more on the model, just that says full of CES and quantity preserving CET functions, as you would expect, coming from the GTAP community, market clearing and key zero profit conditions for every activity, of which there are at least 2 in each grid cell, rain-fed and irrigated crop production. And then there's the decision to irrigate or not, and that's where the CET function comes in. You shift land from one irrigated to rain-fed, but that depends very much on local governance. There are places in the US where that's virtually impossible to expand irrigation because of local water law. And other cases, say Texas, where it's go for broke. If you want to irrigate, go for it. So it varies a lot by locality, and we've tried to build that in through these parameters. More on the data front here, looking at the time, I guess, okay. And so we're working with, I think we're talking CDL data here. Jing and Uris could talk more about that if you're interested. But Iman has drawn heavily on USGS and as well as the WBM water model that we work with. In fact, he has linked Simple G all crops to the WBM model in order to capture the interplay between biophysical and economic outcomes. So that's what's driving the withdrawals. There are separate cost functions for surface and groundwater, and of course those the share you're getting from each of those varies by location. Land supply elasticities have been estimated by Nelson Valoria and others, and water supply elasticities as well. So those are all key parameters in which we're able to incorporate because we've got this gridded representation. So here's some results that Iman has produced for the all crops model. So you can see where the $100 carbon price scenario, you can see the total cropland change, the red meaning cropland exiting crops going into, could be cropland pasture, could be just reverting to some other use. So overall, less than a 1% reduction, but then in particular locations, the reductions could be more significant. What you're seeing on the map are hectares, though, just to make that clear. So now let's hone in on irrigation. And the interesting thing about irrigated agriculture, in this case in the US, in the case of this policy, you've got these two conflicting forces. So you've got the role of fertilizer price increases, and we've seen that already playing potentially to the advantage of rain-fed. Okay, sorry. Let me come back here. Let's start with the energy costs. Okay, the energy costs, higher energy costs, that hurts the irrigated agriculture. And so you can see the blue bars taking us down. So higher energy prices disfavors irrigation and would favor rain-fed. As you can see here, blue bars down for irrigation, a little up for rain-fed. And the fertilizer, it's the other way around. Because you don't have all those irrigation costs, the fertilizer is a larger share of rain-fed production. And so it favors irrigation. So the two tend to offset one another in the aggregate. When you look at the gridded results, that the aggregate is only at the aggregate level. The gridded level, you can see hot spots where, for example, Kansas. We talked about Kansas being an area where they use a lot of natural gas. Natural gas prices are really high. You see a strong exit of irrigated cropland there. The energy prices dominate. At the national level, here we can see some broad indicators. So aggregating across rain-fed and irrigated, crop prices are up, production's down, fertilizer use is down. In this case, water use is up a bit. So there's a bit of a difference. There's a difference because we're talking about all the US, all crops, and there's some differences. We haven't fully squared these two models as they speak to irrigation. We'd have to narrow the spatial extent and some other things to begin to get a better comparison. But overall, on average, things aren't that dramatic. The interesting thing about the gridded approach is it shows that in some cases, the folks impacts are quite significant. And that's what people care about ultimately, what happens on my farm, in my county, in my state. The spatial pattern of production here by USDA production regions. So you've got this fruitful rim around the edges where there's actually an improvement in crop production just because they aren't hit as hard by say the fertilizer increase, for example. The cost structure is different. And you can see big hits in the Northern Great Plains and the Prairie Gateway. Northern Great Plains driven by fertilizer, and the Prairie Gateway, which includes Nebraska, Kansas, and so on, fertilizer and irrigation costs going up. So again, overall average impacts aren't that great on crop production, but they vary a lot, even by these broad production regions. And impacts on costs, and this just shows, in some sense, this should have perhaps come before the previous slide, but the impacts on costs, composition of fertilizer and energy. So in conclusion, climate policy can potentially increase irrigation and withdrawals across the full U.S. We saw for just the corn, soy, and the corn belt that may be work in the other direction, but across the full U.S. it seems that this could exacerbate, in particular, the water problems in the West. There are these two opposing forces. We need to characterize them better, understand them better. And the final impact, of course, depends on these local parameters. So the credibility of your results, but also the richness, depend on these bringing local information to bear. And what we're doing right now under a USDA AFRI grant is to improve the estimation of these parameters at the grid cell level. So I'll stop there. Happy to respond to questions or general discussion if you want to know more about Simple G or other things. I think any of the authors can respond here. Maksym, keep track of time, please.
Sure. Yeah. So far, perfect timing. So.
I'm going to start my video just in the hopes that maybe it'll stimulate a question like, why are you in Berlin? But yeah, Jason.
Yeah, sorry, I keep asking questions, but I'm happy to give way to anyone else who wants to jump in as well. I have a question about Simple G, and this seems to be the place to ask it. So I guess the first thing is, what is water exactly in Simple G? I'm sort of more familiar with sort of the GTAP variants with the water, and there it's a value determined by the yield difference. But then in terms of the everything involved in that additional value you can dump in there, like irrigation costs or whatever. You can let your imagination run wild, but it's the yield difference that's a value. But here you separate it out. Irrigation equipment specifically, and of course energy and labor inputs I'm assuming are also separate inputs. So is water, is that sort of like a physical indicator attached to something, or is there actual endogenous interactions with this water itself?
Yeah, great question. So this is different from GTAP. And that's what's made it advantageous to work with the hydrologists. We're actually, acre feet or cubic meters or whatever you're thinking, you're measuring the water in. That's what we're talking about. And so USGS can tell us how much water is being used, how much of that's groundwater, how much of that's surface water. That is related to the rain-fed irrigated yield differential. So that.
I think Tom fell out again.
I think we lost Tom. He was gambling on the video, so yeah, it was working for a while. So I don't know if Jing or Uris would like to follow up on this point and in terms of water representation in simple while Tom is reconnecting.
Yeah, so I think in corn soil, so we do have the information about irrigation intensity by grade cell. And so we multiply that intensification with the area to get a total amount of physical water used for irrigation. And then the water intensity, the irrigation intensity varies by grade cell. That's the data. And by splitting it into surface and groundwater, I think Iman probably is using some county level, because I don't have that distinction of surface ground in my corn soil, but he probably used some county level information to break it out. And he also estimates some water supply for the grade cells, I guess. So they do have some supply function embedded in the model.
Okay, yeah, because that's sort of that's the key thing, because in GTAP then it's an endowment and you've got elasticity of substitution and there's a price of endowment. So sort of what's the endogenous driver of more or less irrigation water, but that's some supply curve that it tells.
So then, since there's just the one yield curve for irrigated and one for rain-fed, that's kind of implicitly assuming optimal irrigation. And then the cost of irrigation would be based on just the acreage of, like the total acreage of irrigated cropland in each grid cell. Is that, am I thinking about it right, Jing?
Yes, I think those irrigation intensity, those are the ideal amount of irrigation required by crops. So we're assuming if you give crops whatever it needs, so this is the amount.
Okay, so by optimal, that's kind of the biophysically optimal.
Biophysical optimal, yeah.
Not economic.
No.
Yeah.
Right. So is there any endogenous decisions the model makes as to irrigation?
Oh yes. So the baseline data, so it start from the biophysical, I think, but because you have this substitution, you have this constraint on supply side. Of course, farmers will decide how much to use depending on the input cost and the commodity price, and also the cost shares of irrigation for different locations.
I think Uris showed some scheme like that. So there was some substitution elasticity left between sort of land and the whole irrigated system, or between, as you all said, the irrigation equipment, and so yeah.
Yeah, they do.
You guys need to do some more reading too.
No, they do have different layers for the irrigated sector. To up to the very bottom is the input of irrigation devices, equipment, plus the physical water.
So there's no substitution there, or there is.
No, I'm not sure. So yeah, it's an Iman's question.
Yeah. Okay. I have a follow-up question, but I'll let Ron take the floor. His hands up.
Thanks. This is probably a simple question here. You've got all of this very detailed county level data for the U.S. and a lot of sophisticated analysis for the U.S. What's the international trade closure here in these scenarios? What are you assuming about changes in world prices and international market clearing for agricultural commodities here? Are there feedbacks to prices of agricultural products in the U.S.?
The answer should be yes. I think we're using a segmented market. So, no segmented. No, not segmented. Uris, can you confirm that about the closure? Uris is not available. I think not segmented, should be integrated market. So we have a world price of 4 commodities that clears depending on the global supply and demand. Also, for the different locations within the country, they carry the same commodity price, but the input price will vary depending on, could also vary depending on the locations. So we don't have a very sophisticated module of international trade like GTAP capture, so bilateral trade, but just we use the international market to adjust the gap between domestic supply and demand. So that means if you have a shortage of domestic supply, you will import and fill that gap using the international market. But Simple is not able to trace the flow between trade partners.
Sure, great, thanks. Yeah, just wondering if you have a full global market clearing. That's all. Thank you.
We do. That's why we still keep the other non-US regions in the model. So each of them is treated as individual grid cells. It's a big grid cell, but it's still there to capture those connections through trade.
But also just to add, so on the background, we also running envisage model, yeah. So, and from there we get all the bilateral trade flows with an impact of carbon pricing. So in general, we can also compare the results. In this dimension. Yeah,
that's true. Thank you, Maksym. Tom is back.
Okay. I resurfaced.
Okay.
I don't know when I fell out in response to Jason's excellent question about water, but I assume someone answered it, that we're dealing with physical water. And that allows us to interact with hydrological models in a very interesting way.
Yeah, thanks, Jing. Jing also took a nice stab at it, so I got some additional information. Thanks.
Maksym, where are we on timing?
So we still have a couple more minutes. So if there are any follow-up questions, we can address them. But if not, we can also move to David. So yeah.
I came in the middle of Jing's response to Ron on trade, but that is an interesting question about, okay, with GTAP world, we're used to the bilateral trade that we live in. We live with that. Simple was developed, to the first simulations Uris ran was to go back 45 years in time, and so do long run projections. And there, the bilateral component becomes kind of irritating, that you don't necessarily want to keep trading all the time with the same partners. So we found it convenient to go. We have a global bathtub for say corn, soy, that is one world price, and then differentiated, segmented domestic markets. They're segmented on the producer and the consumer side, and that seemed to perform. That's allowed us to at least run these long run simulations and get some reasonable results. That's a challenge, of course, if you're running GTAP, the bilateral data. Those patterns change over the long run, and there's a lot of rigidity.
If there's still one moment, I had an additional question on irrigation equipment and how, if there are any sort of additional restrictions to this, are you treated differently than any other form of capital? So again, in my head, I have the sort of the GTAP water things, and
yeah.
just trying to figure out, because in principle, right, you can buy and sell irrigation equipment. You can. So how does it differ from capital?
Well, it's another type of capital, and in the USDA production accounts, it is identified, that there's irrigation equipment and irrigation labor. So those are entered differently in the production function because we've been able to identify that as a separate input that distinguishes it from rain-fed production, for example. And so furthermore, Iman, as he has worked with the WBM model, has related that those cost relationships and the substitutability back to, the basic types of irrigation. There's the flood, there's the sprinkler and the drip, and those have different cost structures and different characteristics. So you can spend a lot more money and deliver the water more efficiently to the plant. He's actually built in kind of from this hydrological model that characterizes those different types of irrigation. He's been able to create a kind of a transfer function like Jing was talking about, only this time for irrigation equipment. So yeah, he's thought a lot about that. Obviously, I'm just channeling the little I've learned from Iman, but I think what's really interesting about this, not just following up on your questions, it's not just the high resolution, but the ability to speak to the biophysical modelers, to speak to the hydrologists. And that becomes much more satisfying than for them and for us trying to build in their knowledge.
Yeah, that seems to me so key, because you can, you could increase yields by switching from flood to sprinkler because you're more reliable. You can do more with less water if the water source is a bit unreliable, but you couldn't increase yields, say, from drip, or there's nowhere to go.
Well, the other thing that, as you raised that question, working with the hydrologists, we've learned that something like drip may be very efficient in delivering water, but you don't get the recharge from that. So if you flood the field, sure, the plant isn't using it, but someone downstream is getting it. And with the drip, you aren't. So that becomes a very important factor that the hydrologists can help speak to, and turns out to be important from a sustainability perspective. Where's that water going? The water that is not being used. Often it's being reused by others. And so we can be misleading in our prescriptions about efficiency and sustainability. Oh, let's just go to drip, but that means someone downstream's not getting it. I'll shut up. I think, Maksym, we probably need to go on, right?
Yeah, now would be a good moment to proceed to TJ's talk.
All right, then I'll go ahead and get things up and share my screen. All right, is that all set?
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, and you're seeing the full screen view? Yeah. Okay. All right, so this is going to be another application of the Simple G model. For this talk, we're going to be going back to the corn soy version that was discussed in earlier presentations. And we'll be looking at the potential for reducing US biofuels requirements in order to mitigate short-term stressors from population and income growth over the next decade on some of the different environmental outcomes that have been discussed in previous presentations. So I want to first just acknowledge co-authors on this work, many of which have already presented today. The fourth that hasn't is Nathan Geldner, one of my students, and then funding from this came from our Infuse project. So the motivation here, you've heard a lot about some of these issues in the previous talks in the session. So there's kind of benefits of going last here. So I'll have a little bit less detail on the Simple G model itself, and focus primarily on just illustrating this as another application of what we can do with the model for policy analysis. So all of these different food, energy, water nexus kind of outcomes associated with ag production are linked together. Particularly if we're focusing on biofuels, the US renewable fuel standards that mandate production of corn starch-based ethanols and other advanced biofuels, they mandate production, but they're not optimized to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. There was an interesting, good question earlier about how much emissions actually are reduced by introducing the carbon pricing. Having the renewable fuel standards in place does not explicitly target greenhouse gas emissions. It was just kind of assumed that these biofuels have lower life cycle greenhouse gas emissions than petroleum baseline. And depending on your biomass feedstock and prior land use, that's not always the case, of course. On the other hand, ag production is also going to influence hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, depending on nitrogen flux to the Gulf. And there have been estimates saying that we may not be able to solve that problem and meet the goals of the hypoxia task force with the RFS2 mandates in place. So the kind of motivating questions here are, one, just exploring the baseline of understanding how these environmental externalities will change in the future under the current bio-based energy policy, and then to look at reductions in demand associated with a repeal of those targets or adjustments of those targets, to see how much reduced demand for US bio-based energy can compensate for short-term stressors on the agricultural system, like population and income growth. And then finally, we wanted to look at the extent to which reductions in demand for biomass, for bioenergy, would be enabling us to meet these sustainability goals. How close can we get to meeting the hypoxia task force's targets for reducing nitrogen fluxes to the Gulf, for example, using this particular policy lever as an alternative to some of the carbon pricing and wetland restoration and other measures that previous presenters have talked about. So just in terms of the baseline, what we were looking at was the shared socioeconomic pathway 2, which is kind of the middle of the road pathway and trajectory on population and income change around the world. So here we're seeing the trajectory of population growth from 2020 to 2050 that we were looking at using the Simple G model. We were looking at the actual mandates for production in the year 2020, and then changes to the RFS2 mandates as they are required over time to grow. Over half of those production mandates are expected to come from corn, starch-based ethanol, or other conventional biofuels. And so we were looking at demand for corn as kind of a proxy for the biofuels demand here. But biofuels demand is represented as an exogenous shock for demand for corn and soy in the corn and soy version of the Simple G model. On the income side, influencing the kind of demand for different types of calories, we see changes in per capita income largely also increasing over time from the same period of 2020 to 2050. And we're using, of course, the corn soy version of the Simple G model, which the other presenters have talked about in a lot more detail. And so I'll kind of skip over this. But just as a reminder, we're looking at a fairly good resolution in the US, 5 arc minutes, and then the rest of the world represented by 16 other regions. And the outputs that we were looking at for this particular analysis were the corn soy production and yield changes, nitrogen leaching outcomes, land under production, and prices. So all of those except for prices are at the grid cell level. And we introduced shocks to the bio-based energy demand as an exogenous shock in the simple G model. Of course, the actual demand change that would be associated with a change in the RFS2 production mandates is deeply uncertain. There have been a number of estimates in the literature that vary pretty widely in terms of their assertions or estimates about how much demand would be reduced if the RFS2 policy was repealed. There's a little bit less just looking at what the impact would be of reducing the targets to various levels. But the estimates related to repeal are pretty widely varying. And so there's not really a consensus about how the demand would change due to ethanol being used and blended in with fuel for gasoline as an anti-knocking agent. So we're framing this just in terms of looking at reductions in demand. We're not explicitly linking that back to a particular change in the targets from RFS2, but just looking at how reductions in demand would influence these different environmental outcomes. So we looked at a reduction in demand by up to 50% of 2020 levels in the US at 1% intervals, following SSP2 for population, income, and productivity change. And then the baseline demand growth for biofuels outside of the US was coming from the IEA World Energy Outlook. And those projections are somewhat higher than a lot of other projections. And so overall production in the baseline goes up quite a bit compared to some other estimates. So I'll just show key environmental outcomes associated with the demand reductions. And I apologize, my cat wants to be a co-presenter. But relative to business as usual, if we're looking at changes in land use aggregated across the entire US, corn soy production and nitrogen leaching as well. Here we just have traces at 5% intervals to make it a little bit easier to see differences as the demand shock changes and it's further reduced. But essentially, relative to business as usual, land use changes a little bit less than the production and nitrogen leaching outcomes. Change in nitrogen leaching is the largest, but it's pretty similar to the change in corn soy production. Since I was kind of initially thinking about this experiment in terms of analyzing the potential for RFS2 repeal to contribute to meeting the hypoxia task force goal in the Gulf of Mexico, I'm going to focus in some of the later slides more on the nitrogen leaching, but keep in mind that the corn soy production tracks nitrogen leaching pretty closely in terms of both the spatial patterns as well as the absolute and relative changes. So if we're looking relative to 2020 levels, then we can see that we still have rather large increases in production and nitrogen leaching by 2050 over the coming decades, even with a 50% decrease in demand associated with bio-based energy. So you can see, even if the demand is reduced by 50%, corn soy production by 2050 still climbs to 50% higher than 2020 levels. In this case, relative to the 2020 levels, nitrogen leaching is a little bit less sensitive, but it still grows substantially over time. And land use still, even under a pretty large reduction in demand, is catching up again to 2020 levels by around 2035 to 2040. So if we're thinking about this now in terms of reducing demand for biomass, for bioenergy, in order to mitigate the stress of population and income change, then we can do sort of a threshold or break-even analysis here and find that if we wanted to keep nitrogen leaching and land use below 2020 levels until 2025, then a demand reduction of at least 24% would be required in order to achieve that. If we wanted to keep things at 2020 levels all the way out to 2030 for the next decade, then a demand reduction of at least 41% would be required. So again, the estimates in the literature of what the demand reduction would actually be in response to full repeal of the RFS2 policy, some estimates are that demand would be reduced by less than these 24 and 41%. Some other estimates are that demand would be reduced by more than that, or would have been if RFS2 had been repealed a number of years ago. So this is kind of in the range of what we think is potentially plausible based on estimates from the literature, but it's deeply uncertain, right? So there may be other policies that would be required in order to actually achieve these types of demand reductions. So if we look next at the geospatial pattern, then here I'm going to focus on nitrogen leaching, and relative to the status quo, we can see that the left-hand pane is showing the nitrogen leaching change associated with that 24% reduction in demand. That would keep nitrogen leaching at 2020 levels in aggregate to the year 2030. And then on the right-hand pane, we're looking at the 41% reduction. The map is a little bit more sparse out west, again, because we're just focusing on corn and soy production, where there's not as much in the west compared to some of the maps that you were seeing of the all crops results in previous presentations. If we look at the results relative to 2020 levels, then here's where you can see the impact of this 41% demand reduction in the top right pane, for example, that everything is pretty uniformly yellow. This was the level that would keep things at 2020 levels until the year 2030, which is the top pane, the year that we're looking at. And so everything across the country and all the grid cells is pretty close to still being at the 2020 level. But then you can see there's a gradual increase still over time. And the spatial pattern is pretty consistent over time, as well as across the different metrics. So if I was to look at a map of the land change, land use change, or the total production of corn and soy, it would look pretty similar to this. If we wanted to then kind of zoom in on particular watersheds, the Mississippi River Basin being one of interest related to the hypoxia task force, but then if we also wanted to look at impacts in the Great Lakes and try and potentially translate this to looking at the risk of harmful algal blooms, then we could do that. Same in the Chesapeake Bay. And what we see is that there's not a whole lot of difference across the major watersheds as well. So if you were looking, for example, at change in land use in the year 2030, 7.5% less in the Mississippi River Basin compared to 7 or 8 in other watersheds. So not a whole lot of variation across the major watersheds where corn and soy are being produced intensively. Relative to 2020 levels, this just gives a little bit more kind of the tabular information if you are having trouble looking at the maps and discerning the color ramps, that by 2030, land use change is about 5% greater or so in each of the watersheds, with a 24% reduction in demand. It's about the same in 2030 because, again, this 41% reduction was chosen so that land use and leaching would be about the same as 2020 levels. But then we have increases from there. So just to conclude and open things up for questions, if we were to repeal RFS2, there's potential here for this to mitigate some of the short-term stress associated with population and income growth around the world. The actual demand change, of course, is deeply uncertain. And the magnitude of these changes that we were looking at, for example, the nitrogen leaching outcomes relative to 2020 levels, nitrogen leaching still increasing over time, even with a pretty large demand reduction. And so we can see that this is not going to be a solution on its own, at least to managing the hypoxia target from the hypoxia task force, which is looking to try and reduce nitrogen fluxes to the Gulf by about 45%. However, there are still, of course, other benefits potentially to doing this. And at this point, I will open things up for questions. And I'll stop sharing my screen again so that we can see each other.
Thanks, DJ. Questions?
Yes, Angela?
Yes. So Dave, very nice presentation. I think this work with Simple G is quite amazing, how this spatial to national and national to spatial communication of variables is amazing to get those things. But I have a first question that's more a clarification question. I understood that your baseline projection of how much corn we will need to satisfy RFS is based on assuming that the RFS targets will be in place until 2050, right?
That's right. We were looking at how the targets are changing over time based on the latest set of targets, from 2022.
Okay. So my question is more to understand if the outcome that you got is just a general outcome, how much better will be for environment to reduce total corn production, or how much better will be for environment to reduce corn production towards RFS? It seems to me that you have both at the same time, but as you need to make some assumption about your RFS target, you are selling the paper as how much RFS could, if reduced, could help environmental targets, right? And as we have this uncertainty about what will be RFS in 20, 30, 40, or 50, it seems that the message gets a very bad negative idea about, okay, having biofuels, corn biofuels is very bad, let's remove that. This is the problem. Well, the problem is growing corn production, right? It doesn't matter if it's for biofuels or for human, for feedstock for animals or for humans. And then it comes my second comment or question about that. If we have this problem of growing corn to satisfy fuels or energy for people, or food for animals or food for people, how we can get from your analysis a more holistic trade-off measurement of, okay, if I cannot get energy from biofuels, how am I going to get, what are there other options that will lead to better outcomes? And it's something that, coming from a CG background, we always are trying to frame the questions in that way. Okay, I know that if I have less crop production, it will be better for the environment. I'm sure it will be, right? But how I measure the trade-offs between, okay, if I cannot have RFS, is there something better in place that I could replace that energy demand? Are there other alternatives? And probably the Simple G will not be the tool to address that, but I think it would be very nice if you could elaborate those when you write a paper. So people will not feel the comfortable thing about, okay, we are looking at one side of the problem, but what about the other sides? How am I going to replace that bioenergy demand by other kind of fossil fuel energy? Is going to be better, worse? So this is my question that maybe you can comment on.
Yeah, I appreciate those comments. They're well taken. So in terms of how we are framing the results here, the initial motivating question was looking at repeal of RFS2, but as you can kind of see, the results that we're seeing kind of have changed the relevance of RFS2 versus just a general reduction in demand. So I think given the uncertainty in the literature of how much demand would be reduced if the policy was repealed, the framing of the results is more focused just on a general demand reduction, with RFS2 being probably the most obvious way to achieve those reductions, or at least part of them. But your point is very well taken that other ways of achieving those demand reductions could be put in place through policy in order to reduce demand for corn and soy as a livestock feed and other uses. So I think that's well taken. There are other mechanisms in which the demand reduction could be achieved. But then in terms of the overall trade-offs between some of these other goals in a larger, more CDE framework, that's also well taken in terms of what would happen to the energy production if it's not coming from bio-based energy. So in this model, where we're just looking at focused on corn soy production, the land use change is looking at change in land for corn and soy production, but not answering the question of what that land would be used for. There was a question that came up in one of the earlier presentations around that too, as to whether that means the land is going back to natural uses or being used for other crops, which would have different environmental impacts, of course. And you're right that the answer to those questions of what the actual greenhouse gas emissions impact might be due to the energy coming from other sources if biomass demand is reduced, is something that we are exploring now, of thinking of taking the results from the Simplified model and also coupling those with the envisaged model to get a better understanding of how the energy mix would shift given a change in this policy, and then translating that to emissions changes. So I think you're right that there are other kind of next steps that we can take to get a more holistic picture of what the trade-offs are, bringing in emissions and some of the other kind of second order factors of how things would change in response to this policy. Yeah. Other questions or comments?
I have a brief comment. So just reflecting also on the previous set of presentations, I was thinking that, as you also just referred, linking this with mitigation policies in dynamic CG like envisage might be an interesting point. Also looking what are the interactions. So like with Jing, we are looking into interactions between wetland and carbon pricing in the context of hypoxia task force goal. So here the same could be done, but linking carbon pricing impacts with RFS impacts, yeah, and seeing whether it would bring closer to the hypoxia task force goal, yeah, and then also bring in impacts of nitrogen prices, but also energy kind of demand impacts, yeah. So.
Yeah, thanks, Maksym.
So another question I have, DJ, is you show some land use reduction out of the repeal, but if those lands stay in, for example, corn belt, of course it will not be fallowed, so it will continue to be used by farmers probably for other crops, and those will again generate some leaching and use nitrogen fertilizer. Yeah, I don't know if that will change the current result a little bit, probably not very much. So yeah, how do you take the land to some other activities?
Yeah, that's a good question, and kind of gets to differences in the different versions of the simple G model. If we were to look at this using the all crops model, we might get a more complete picture of that. But Uris and Jing yourself, you could probably comment more on some of the complications that might also introduce at the same time, right?
You know, one thought along those lines, we've often thought about in any version of simple G, characterizing all the land uses within the grid cell and having a CET function or a QCET, something determining that allocation. So in that case, we would generate results about where the land is going, conditional on the assumption that other rental prices aren't changing. So even though we're not modeling the other uses, incorporating them in the database and in the model would have some value, I think, and would begin to start scratching the surface of these questions that Angelo and Mark earlier on were raising. At least we could see, is it the case that those grid cells with producing corn, soy in the Midwest, there's really no other crop there. It's they're using all of the land, or they're there's some pasture. Knowing what else is there would be useful in beginning to address some of these questions. It would only take us part way, but that's a thought. I think that's where we're headed, but we haven't implemented it yet.
Right.
Well, we can wrap things up early. Nothing against that. I believe for those of you who are interested, there's a plenary session coming at the top of the hour, which should be pretty interesting. Trade focus today, yeah. Anything else, Maksym, to be added here?
But from the fact that it was a great session, I think nothing.
Yeah. No, it was great to hear these different perspectives, and the questions from the audience were very helpful. I think as we start to, it's one thing to develop a model like this in your back room. It's another thing to bring it out and have people eye it this way and that and ask questions. I think it's very useful to get this feedback. So thanks to everyone for participating, and look forward to seeing these things written up. So thanks to all, and look forward to seeing you in other sessions.